All right, why am I talking to you? That's a good question also. And not totally sure. I mean, Dan called me up and said, you should talk about this. But I've been a Christian for 55 plus years and have made sort of that move, if you will, from American evangelicalism to the Reformation, particularly Lutheran. And it's impacted the way I think about things. So, purpose, work, business relationships, and then the next one is how I relate to partners, employees, and customers in my business network. So my hope today, go for that, is that there's something helpful here, that there's something that lifts a burden. I mean, that's, to me, what Christ Hold Fast is largely about, is to lift a burden because Christ has done it for you, sets you free to be who you are. And so let's see how it goes. But number one, I want to tell you what I kind of used as sources. On the left, God at Work by Gene Veith, a good book. Tim Keller, some of you probably know him here in New York. His book, Every Good Endeavor, is great. Lee Hardy wrote that one about 20 years ago, The Fabric of This World. I used all those fairly extensively. So let's do some definitions. I'm the kind of guy that likes to have people understand what I'm talking about. So what is vocation? And in Latin, the first one, we know that. It's a summons, an invitation, a calling. You've heard that. Webster says it's the work that a person does, or I like the second half, should be doing. 1 Corinthians 7:17 is the one that uses the word in Paul's letters, the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. And I just always like to stop there and say, notice who's running the verbs here. You get that idea? Who's doing the doing? And then lastly, Luther said this, and we'll come back to this one. What God does in and through us is your vocation. A lot of times it's easy to think it's what I do. I'm going to suggest that we flip that around. The word, of course, came from the idea of being called by the gospel, being saved, and you can see that in 2 Thessalonians, you can see that in 1 Corinthians. My talk today is about the vocation of, well, what did Dan call it in the secular world? I was going to call it the vocation of work, the idea that we get up every day and we do something that has the fringe benefit of being a salary generator. But the way that we as human beings have thought about work has changed a lot over the years. The ancient Greeks had an interesting view of it. And I'm going to read you some quotes that refer to this one. The ancient Greeks associated work with that endless cycle of activity forced upon us by embodied existence. They referred to it as animal futility, the idea that we work in order to eat, we eat in order to work, until our bodies wear down, die, and disintegrate, leaving nothing behind but the dust from which they came. That's encouraging, yeah? That's so here's Aristotle on the same idea. The reason that you maybe heard that, embodied existence, it comes from that idea that the Greeks were really the biggest people that talked about this a lot, was that the body and the mind are not only separate, but one of them's good, the mind, and one of them's not so good, the body. So Aristotle thought that the gods were pure, self-contained mental substances fixed in the distant heavens above, calm, silent, contemplating all truth for eternity, complete within themselves. They lacked nothing, and the gods have no need to interact with other persons. And he would say that only when the philosopher is surrounded by the protective walls of enforced labor and social stability, that means slaves working for you, shielding him from the intrusions of both natural and political necessity, he can turn his mind undisturbed to matters of eternal import. So there was a real dichotomy here between working, which was what the animals did, and thinking, which is what the humans did. Now, what's interesting, next one, Brian, is in the post-Nicene church, meaning after about 350 AD, when Christianity was cool in the Roman Empire, the church kind of took that same view. Here's Augustine, famous saint. We all love him for a lot of things. But he actually said the contemplation of God is promised us as the goal of all of our actions and the eternal perfection of happiness. And he said also, only obligations of charity, he talked about the obligation of loving your neighbor, make us undertake virtuous activity. If no one lays this burden upon us, we should give ourselves over in leisure to study and contemplation. And then Aquinas, my friend Scott mentioned Aquinas, the contemplative life is according to that which is the most proper to man, namely his intellect. And now the last one I'll share you on that one is Gregory the Great, one of the popes from, I forget the dates. The contemplative life is greater in merit, nice word, than the active, which labors in the exercise of present work, while the other, the contemplative life, already tastes with inward savor the rest that is to come. Now, we're talking about rest, but I'm going to connect them in a different way. And then he finally said, although the active life is good, the contemplative life is better. Now, let's go to the next one, Brian, the Renaissance view. In the Renaissance, all of a sudden, people started to think a little different. This came about in the 15th century, so maybe 100 years before Luther. And they began to think that human beings were more like the God of Christianity, and they recognized that the God of Christianity worked. He created the world, and he worked, and he rested. So the Renaissance view was human beings were not to become like God through mere thinking, but through productive activity, after God, working like God did. To be created in the image of God meant not only possessing an intellect, but hands as well, so that what was envisioned by the mind could be ushered into reality by the formative powers of the body. God created nature out of nothing. Humankind would now create a culture, a world out of nature. So we were becoming a demigod, was the idea. And then finally, the post-Enlightenment view, and this is Karl Marx primarily. What distinguishes human beings from the animals, according to Marx, is not the ability to think, but rather the ability to gauge in free, productive activity, to do what you want, basically, and to produce things. And he said, unlike the animals who are unreflectively immersed in their own patterns of behavior, human beings are conscious of what they are doing. They can step back from it, and so they can then, instead of contemplating God, we are to find our fulfillment in contemplating ourselves in the works of our hands. I don't know about you, but I'm confused at this point because you've got Western cultural tradition swinging back and forth. On the one hand, work seemed to debase human life just to mere animal existence, scratching out a living on the surface of the earth. On the other hand, work seemed to be the agent by which humanity elevates itself to a position of being a god. So, on to my experience. This is where I hope there's something that connects to some of you. I had to live through, in probably the first 20, 30 years of my Christian life, with the idea of dualism, not the kind that you think of Platonic dualism or whatever, but here's a quote by a guy named William Deal. If lay people cannot find any spiritual meaning in their work, they are condemned to living a certain dual life, not connecting what they do on Sunday with what they do the rest of the week. And in my experience, the idea of calling or a vocation was kind of limited to the exercise of your spiritual gifts in order to build up the church. I mean, that's how you kind of thought about it. And that's what our church taught us. Yeah, you go to work during the week, but you need to have your ministry here, right? And so I listen to that today and I go, wow, that sounds like the medieval church. That the spiritual is this good thing and the world is this bad thing. And in fact, I'll just make a comment. I heard Scott and Jessica this morning use the word mundane several times. You remember that word? And it struck me as interesting that the word mundane comes from the Latin for world. So we now today think of stuff that's mundane as kind of beneath us. And it came from that Middle Ages idea that the world was beneath us. So the implicit conclusion was that to be fully Christian, you had to operate in your ministry in the church. So that's my next one up there, I think. Yeah. That the sacred is more important. We had the fun one of spiritual and carnal. I remember that. Don't be a carnal Christian. That was really cool. Go to the next one, Brian. Everybody must have a ministry. There's a Christian version of everything. And there's still, you can go on the web today and find all sorts of things for how to find your your Christian ministry. They'll give you tests and personality, this and that. And here's one that I've found called the Barnabas Network, to discover how God has prepared you for serving God and others. So far, so good. In and through the local church. Yeah, that's not all, but okay. And here's my favorite, so that we can do God's work God's way and God's power with God's results. And if that isn't a burden, I'm not quite sure what it is. It never got this bad, though, when my church, this is from my favorite little satire site called the Babylon Bee. Church declares every possible activity a ministry. I have the whole article here, but I won't read it to you. I will try to find the one thing that cracked me up the most. Yeah, here it is. After they figured out that they could do something like an NFL watching ministry on Sunday afternoons, that's when things really started happening. That's when our interpretive dance ministry, our experimental drama ministry, our dubstep ministry, our Pilates ministry, our hot yoga ministry, our cold yoga ministry, our recycling ministry, our cycling ministry, and our unicycling ministry all got started after that. I highly commend the Babylon Bee to you. They make fun of the church in really deep ways. It gets worse, though. Go to the next one, Brian. There's a stark division between the Christian life and your secular life as a result of this thinking. This is that idea. I'll quote from Tim Keller on this. The dualistic approach, however, is even more prevalent and, based on our experience, even more difficult to dismantle. In this approach, Christians think of themselves as Christians only within church activity. Their Christian life is what they do on Sundays and weeknights when they engage in spiritual activities. And by contrast, yeah, keep it going, Brian. What they do in the work week is completely separate and disconnected. Next one. I do my work thing and then on. So as I look at it, I say something's not right here. Again, Tim Keller says the first form of dualism, which is that idea that there's a Christian version of everything, fails to grasp the importance of what we have in common with the world, that there are good people and good workers in the world, that it doesn't have to be Christian. And it's this idea, common grace, is that every person on earth, and you'll hear more about this as I get more into the vocation of work, every person on earth is a major instrument of God's providence. It's how he sustains the human world. There's a lot of Luther quotes about bakers and things there, and we might get to some of them. The other reaction, though, is that idea that I can have my church life and then I have to have my work life. And it's like a schizophrenia where we almost act as secret Christians in the workplace. And part of that's because we don't want to be that guy that annoys everybody by quoting Bible verses or whatever. So we kind of hide it. And then lastly, keep it going, Brian, sorry. Must everything be done in his name? Covert. And then the last one that I'll share you is the hypocrite. And I call it getting broed. Anybody know what I mean by that? Getting broed? Oh, it's great. I have a bunch of friends in the Christian music industry, and let's just say it's uglier than almost anything you can imagine in the Christian music industry. And getting broed is the classic one where, like, I need Blake to do some recording on my next record or something, and I ask him to play the guitar parts, but I say, Blake, I don't really have a lot of money, but this is for the Lord, Blake. It's part of your ministry, so you could do it for free, right? It happens way too many times, and I think it's a result of that whole concept that there's this sacred thing here, and it's different than loving your neighbor in this world and doing good work. So here's the good part. Next, the good news of vocation is that this secular spiritual thing is a false dichotomy. And you can see the scripture there from Colossians. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. So it isn't a matter of what you do in the church or not. And then the next one, this is a quote from our buddy Luther. And this was his response to that Middle Ages thing. It's pure invention that Pope, bishops, priests, and monks are called the spiritual estate, while princes, lords, artisans, and farmers are called the temporal estate. So that's your spiritual, your carnal. This is indeed a piece of deceit and hypocrisy, yet no one need be intimidated by it, and that for this reason, all Christians are truly of the spiritual estate, and there is no difference among them except that of office. So, next slide, Brian. I'm going to read you some stuff from Dorothy Sayers. And Dorothy Sayers, you guys know the name? She was an English woman, friend of Lewis and Tolkien, part of the Inklings, arguably. Wrote some Lord Peter Wimsey detective novels. Pretty good thinker. And I'm going to read this to you, and it's probably going to be the main thing I do. But I think it's pretty good. So, it is the business of the church to recognize that secular vocation as such is sacred. Christian people, and particularly perhaps the Christian clergy, must get it firmly into their heads that when a man or woman is called to a particular job of secular work, that is as true a vocation as though he or she were called specifically to religious work. The church must concern herself not only with such questions as the just price and proper working conditions, she must concern herself with seeing that work itself is such as a human being can perform without degradation, that no one is required by economic or any other considerations to devote himself to work that is contemptible, soul-destroying, or harmful. It is not right for the church to acquiesce in the notion that a man's life is divided into the time he spends on his work and the time he spends serving God. He must be able to serve God in his work, and the work itself must be accepted and respected as the medium of divine creation. In nothing has the church so lost her hold on reality as in her failure to understand and respect the secular vocation. She has allowed work and religion to become separate departments and is astonished to find that, as a result, the secular work of the world is turned to purely selfish and destructive ends, and that the greater part of the world's intelligent workers have become irreligious or at least uninterested in religion. But is it really astonishing? How can anyone remain interested in a religion which seems to have no concern with 9/10 of his life? The church's approach to an intelligent carpenter is usually confined to exhorting him not to be drunk and disorderly in his leisure hours and to come to church on Sundays. What the church should be telling the carpenter is this: that the very first demand of his religion makes upon him is that he should make good tables. Church by all means, and decent forms of amusement certainly, but what use is all that if in the very center of his life and occupation he is insulting God with bad carpentry? No crooked table legs or ill-fitting doors ever, I dare swear, came out of the carpenter's shop at Nazareth. Nor, if they did, could anyone believe that they were made by the same hand that made heaven and earth. No piety in the worker will compensate for work that is not true to itself, for any work that is untrue to its own technique is a living lie. Yet in her own buildings, in her own ecclesiastical art and music, in her hymns and prayers, in her sermons and her little books of devotion, the church will tolerate or permit a pious intention to excuse so ugly, so pretentious, so tawdry and twaddling, that's a good British word, I don't know that one, so insincere and insipid, so bad as to shock and horrify any decent draftsman. We heard something on the panel earlier about bad pictures that are Christianized. And why? Back to Sayers. Simply because the church has lost all sense of the fact that the living and eternal truth is expressed in work only so far as that work is true in itself, and to the standards of its own technique. She has forgotten that the secular vocation is sacred, forgotten that a building must be good architecture before it can be a good church, that a painting must be well painted before it can be a good sacred picture, that work must be good work before it can call itself God's work. Let the church remember this, that every maker and worker is called to serve God in his profession or trade, not outside it. The apostles complained rightly when they said it was not meet they should leave the word of God and serve tables. Their vocation was to preach the word. But those whose vocation it is to prepare the meals beautifully might with equal justice protest, it is not meet to leave the service of our tables to preach the word. The official church wastes time and energy and moreover commits sacrilege in demanding that secular workers should neglect their proper vocation in order to do Christian work, by which she means ecclesiastical work. The only Christian work is good work well done. That's Christian work. Let the church see to it that the workers are Christian people and do their work well. As to God, then all work will be Christian work, whether it is church embroidery or sewage farming. As Jacques Maritain says, if you want to produce Christian work, be a Christian and try to make a work of beauty into which you have put your heart. Do not adopt a Christian pose. He is right. And let the church remember that the beauty of the work will be judged by its own and not by ecclesiastical standards. She kind of sets up, if you will, a conflict in the Great Commandment between loving God and loving your neighbor. She wants to tell you that you need to serve God first and you think about your neighbor later. And I'm going to suggest that in many things, I loved what Sayers said, but I think she misses something here. And this is where Luther is super helpful. The good news here is we don't have to stress out, as I like to say, with mental gymnastics to check our motivations and priorities with respect to serving God and serving neighbor. It's a both and. So let's go to the next one. Gene Veith, in one of those books I mentioned, whoever our neighbors are in our vocations, we are all to see Christ in one another. He accepts what we do for others as if we had done it for him. It turns out that when we love and serve our neighbors, we are loving and serving him, God, after all. And that's the Matthew 25 piece that Jesus talks about. So next slide, Brian. So there's no conflict, and one more push. And it's off the bottom of the page, naturally. How about that? Doesn't fit so well. So the other piece of good news that shows up in that is that it's not primarily about you. Let me read the next quote from Veith. Go to the next page. What is distinctive in this thought that Luther gave us is that instead of seeing vocation as a matter of what we should do, what we must do as a Christian worker or citizen or parent, Luther emphasizes what God does in and through us in vocation. So now a little bit more about me, and I'm almost done. Next one. Several vocations. We've already heard mother. We've already heard father. We heard a little bit, something like what I'm talking about earlier from David Kim. We're going to hear some other ones, but let's click through these. A vocation as a husband, as a parent, as a church member, as a teacher, as a citizen, as a worker, and then below that is as an employer. And then next, you think about who is my neighbor. Pretty much everybody, really. My wife, obviously, my children, my church, my students, my country, my customers, my employees, and my partners. And there's probably another one that I can't even remember. So here's some just examples from my work, the way that I think about this nowadays. First one is with my partners. I serve my partners by being trustworthy and accountable to them, open to them. I serve my employees by candor, speaking the truth in love, but speaking the truth, high expectations for all. One of the things I've been convinced of is there's nothing worse than having a high performer that sees you letting a slacker get off. That just demotivates and ruins everybody's day. So openness, candor, high expectations, generosity. That's another way that you love and serve. And then for customers, vendors, it's about excellence. And I put in there control what you can control. In my business, which is in the investment world, there's an awful lot you can't control. You guys just listen to the stock market report each day and you know that. So let's go to the next one. So how should you serve God and neighbor in your job? And you've seen some of this. By evangelizing your colleagues, by furthering social justice, by engaging and influencing culture, skillful, excellent work, yes. Keep going, Brian. By creating beauty, by being grateful and joyful, by doing what gives you the greatest joy, by making lots of money so that you can be generous. And what it says on the bottom that you can't see there was, why not all of the above? As you think about what you do in your work, again, thinking about this idea that you are free to serve your neighbor, then all of those come into play. Now, let me elaborate on that, and then we're done. The trap, go Brian, is, and we heard this a little earlier, many today seek a kind of salvation from career success, self-esteem, self-justification. We're addicted to that. And there's some sociologists that have really sort of identified this. This is from Robert Bella. He says, the meaning of work has been too long informed by the spirit of modern individualism, which promotes the idea of work as a means of private advancement rather than public contribution. And the last one, the spirit which will rend the social fabric of our society, erode our institutions if allowed to have full sway. So I'm suggesting that this idea that we see work as self-justification, what I was sharing earlier with my niece Shannon, is it's the work beneath the work. It's why you do what you do. If that's about justifying yourself and making you the center of things, sociologists are even worried about this. So vocation is freedom. This is the main point. It frees us from the relentless pressure of having to prove ourselves and secure identity from our work because we're already proven and secure. Free from a condescending attitude towards less sophisticated, free from envy over more exalted work. The idea is that if we have everything we need on account of Christ, you've heard it said a few times, if we are already secure and at rest because we know God has accepted us and what we do as work has no value in adding to that, then we're free to give everything. To give everything to our neighbor. And this is where I always do my favorite prayer in the Bible, which is, Lord, I believe, help me in my unbelief. I think that's the proper prayer of every Christian, because this is insanely good news that is really hard to believe. So, seeing your job as a calling, called by someone, that's one thing I didn't hear this morning. I heard a lot about God has called you, but I just love to emphasize the idea that we don't choose what we do in the long run. It's God has called us to this thing. And so it reframes things to the reality that our work, what it really is, it's all gift. It's this idea that we've been given something to do that serves our neighbor's given stuff to do that serves us. It's the way God has designed society. It involves every human being. That's the common grace idea. And so our freedom as Christians to know that none of this depends on us allows us to just go at it full bore. We're free to be, as Scott likes to say. So through me, God gives gifts to neighbors. And of course, through my neighbor, God gives gifts to me. It's all gift all the way around. So I'll end with this quote from Luther. Why should I not therefore freely, joyfully, with all my heart and with an eager will, give myself as Christ to my neighbor, just as Christ offered himself to me, since through faith I have an abundance of all good things in Christ Jesus. So here's my plugs. That book on the left, The Christian Life, Cross or Glory, it's a monumental book by Stephen Hine. It touches on a lot of this. It's not directly about vocation. It's about how you live your life loving God and loving neighbor and how those intersect. So it covers all those vocations we talked about. 1517 is the publisher of it, and I'm obviously involved in that. And then the last shameless plug is a couple of things that we do over at 1517 about vocation that I commend to you. Virtue in the Wasteland is a really fun podcast. And the League of Faithful Masks is one of our projects. I didn't even mention it, but where does that funny word come from? It's this idea that we, as we serve our neighbor, are the mask of God. It comes from that basic concept that God is hidden in everything in the world. God is hidden in your neighbor. That's why serving your neighbor is serving God. That's why what you do in your work is sacred, because God is hidden in the ordinary things of life. So thanks for listening.